Wichita Liberty TV, featuring host Bob Weeks. Local politics without the spin. Interviews with nationally respected economists. Hear directly from Kansas conservatives about what matters to you. It's individual liberty, limited government, and free markets. Wichita Liberty TV.
Hello, I'm Bob Weeks for Wichita Liberty TV, your weekly source for news, analysis, and commentary about government and public affairs in Kansas and Wichita. Broadcast on Great Plains Television, that's channel 26.1, Sunday mornings at 8:30, repeated again at 4:30. You can also find Wichita Liberty TV at my site. That's the Voice for Liberty, wichitaliberty.org. You'll find all the past episodes of Wichita Liberty TV, show notes for each episode, and of course all the other material we create for Wichita Liberty TV or wichitaliberty.org almost every day. Well, today's guest is Shari Howard McMinn. She was a guest, you may remember, on Wichita Liberty TV about 2 years ago when her book, Stretched Yet Unbroken, was published. I've known Shari for a while because she's from Wichita. We went to school and church together. For many years then, she was a commercial interior designer working out of Denver, Colorado. Then she stepped aside from that career to homeschool her children, and about the same time she and her husband Carrie moved to a farm in the remote stretches of northeastern Colorado, and where they still live today as a farmer. Unfortunately, her husband Carrie passed away a few years ago, but here she is here today. So welcome to Wichita Liberty TV.
Thank you, Paul. I'm glad to be here.
I should mention Carl Peter John's on vacation this week, so not with us. So Shari, your latest book is about adoption here. I think I saw part of the title was You Can Do It, so it sounds like an encouraging or a self-help book. Tell us a little bit about that, if you would, please.
Well, adoption, encouragement, and advice for a hopeful journey. I started 6 years ago, maybe even 7 years ago, because my husband and I felt like there were a lot of things that we wish we had known before we began our adoption journey about 14 years ago. We are both avid researchers, and we did an extensive amount of research learning about trauma and raising traumatized children and raising blended families and how adopted children can be different to raise than biological children. And my husband encouraged me that I should write a book about what we had learned together, because there are books about how to start adoption and books about why to do adoption. And there's books, in fact, one just recently published this summer about kind of the horrors of adoption, but nothing that really says, when this happens, try this. And so the book has actually a lot of short chapters. There's, I think, maybe close to 75 chapters, but they're only 2 to 3 pages long. And the intent is that a husband and wife would read the chapters, and then once a week they would answer the discussion questions together, and then they would go have a fun, creative date at home. Because when you have adopted children, it's unlikely that you're able to really leave them with other people because they have trauma and loss issues. So everybody's just home all the time. And I feel like it's really important to maintain a healthy, strong marriage in order to raise adopted children. So that's why I wrote the book. And you're, I think, very, I want to say, uniquely qualified to do this because you and your husband had several of your own children, and then the adopted children after that. Yes. When I met my husband, he actually was divorced, and so my oldest son is my stepson. And then we went on to have 5 birth children, and one of our youngest daughter died as an infant, so we had 4, and we really wanted more kids. So we decided that we would pursue adoption. So we adopted twice, 2 different sets of siblings, a brother and sister about 14 years ago, and then 2 sisters and a brother about 12 years ago.
And these children, some of them were, I think, as you described, special needs children. How is that characteristic of adopted children? Or, I mean, a lot do come from unfortunate circumstances. Is that, I guess, the best way to put it?
Right. You know, children, especially adopted through child welfare, but also from, say, war-torn countries on the other side of the world, They have trauma and loss issues because they are no longer with their birth parents, and there's a primal wound that is hard to fill once they are separated from their birth parents. And so that automatically is a special need. But many children, because of lack of health, lack of prenatal care, just the situation surrounding their being placed for adoption, there are a lot of special needs. They could be learning delays, they could be health issues. If children are severely neglected, they are not going to have good speech. They are not going to know how to focus on learning. They have very short attention spans. A lot of them have sensory issues. Every single one of those is considered special needs. And through child welfare adoption, any siblings are considered special needs just because there's more than one. There's just a lot of different labels, and our kids all came to us with specific labels that had been identified, but also as we got to know them through the years, there were a lot of other labels we uncovered, like dyslexia, vision tracking problems, really emotional and social delays, all of those things.
Yeah. Well, Shari, hold on to that thought. When we come back, I want to continue exploring this topic. So, Bob Weeks for Wichita Liberty TV. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks. With me this week, author Shari Howard McMinn. We were talking about adoption in your book, Shari, and I think before the show started, I wondered about people who go to great lengths to adopt children from overseas countries. I personally know people who have adopted children from Siberia, Ethiopia, Haiti, some countries like that. Why would they do that, perhaps? I think you had some insight into that.
Well, I think there's a number of reasons. That's certainly something we looked at, and then we decided to go with domestic adoption through child welfare. The child welfare system in the United States is a good system, but it has many, many flaws, and it is very difficult to be a foster parent. There's a lot of shaming that goes on about foster parents who want to adopt children, and that's really the only way that you can enter domestic adoption unless you do a private adoption. So
is it kind of like a trial period, so to speak, being a foster parent?
You agree, you take training to become a foster parent, then foster children are placed with you, and some of them really just have horrible behavior and overwhelming circumstances because they've been in foster care a long time, or there's little babies that might have drug addiction, and that's hard to deal with. But I think there's also an aspect that there are a lot of Christian adoption agencies overseas, and there are a lot of Christians who want to adopt, and it's easier to work with a faith-based adoption agency, and people have a heart for adopting children from Russia or Kyrgyzstan or China or wherever. So the nice thing is there's a wide spectrum in the adoption world. It is very expensive to do private adoption. It's very expensive to do overseas adoptions, but there are agencies in place that help families do that. And then if you do child welfare adoption, the costs are very low, but there are more bigger hurdles to handle than if you do overseas adoption sometimes.
And obviously for people younger than me, I guess the best thing they could do is be an adoptive parent. But for people who either can't do that, or too old or whatever, what can we do to help support the culture of adoption? I think that's especially important for conservatives like you and I who are opposed to abortion, would like to see abortion squashed down as much as possible. We're often criticized for being more concerned about the unborn child. Well, they don't call it a child, necessarily, but the unborn child, once they're born, we don't really care because we're also kind of opposed to social welfare programs too. So do the two relate? Am I just crazy about that? Or?
No, the two are very much intertwined. And in my book, the very last chapter second to last chapter of the book is what the church should do about adoption. And there are a lot of churches and parachurch agencies that are now understanding that adoptive families need help. They need prayer support, they need physical, tangible needs met, they need respite care, but they also just need to be loved, and their children need to be welcomed in a traditional church. And these kids can have a lot of behavior issues. They can have sensory needs. There's too much light, too much noise. As a family, we had a hard time finding a church to feel comfortable once we had our 5 adopted children. So we drive a long way to church. We drive about an hour and a half to a church that it's family integrated, so it does not have separate Sunday school or children's programs, so our kids could be with us at all times, which I think is a very important thing to realize about having adopted children. They have trust issues, and if they can be with you all the time, then they will have a better bonding mechanism with your family.
Interesting. So, yeah, and it's really tough for the children, I think, too. I mean, many of these are from families where I know one person, these children were from Siberia, but they had fetal alcohol syndrome.
Right.
Their children, and it probably gets even worse than that, does it?
It does, and some of my children had very minor labels, some of them had very severe. Probably the most severe label that a child can have is reactive attachment disorder, and that means, in short, that when they were an infant or a toddler up to about the age of 3, when all the social, emotional development of your brain takes place, their needs were not met. When they needed a loving caregiver, they did not have one. And so, do you remember back in the 1990s about the Romanian orphans that came to America after Ceausescu's nation had fallen? And those kids had just been warehoused in cribs. They had never known human touch. They'd never known really a caring adult to come pick them up, change their diaper. And so reactive attachment disorder is when there has been disorganized attachment in the child's young life, and it's really, really hard to overcome. A couple of my children have that, and we have to work on it every day. And my son, who's almost 21, is a very successful Marine now. He has overcome it, but it took daily work. And I think a lot of adoptive parents think that when they get their kids, they're just going to go about their regular business of putting the kid in school, going to work, coming home, and it's not that. It's very intensive and intentional parenting. And if parents have no other children, no biological children, and they're going into adoption, they really need to find some books or resources or trainings about being very high quality, intentional parents, and realize that it takes a lot of work.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah. Well, you mentioned schooling there, so when we come back, I want to talk to you about your experience in homeschooling, which I know something else you have a great deal of experience with. Bob Weeks for Wichita Liberty TV. We'll be back in a moment. Well, welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm your host, Bob Weeks, with Shari Howard McMinn, author this week. And Shari, one of the things that you've done quite a bit is homeschooling. And you know, in Kansas here, we don't have much school choice. I know Colorado does. They have charter schools, a thriving community there. We don't have vouchers here. We have a very small tax credit scholarship program, less than 200 people. It costs the state about $550,000 a year, yet it's under continual attack as an existential threat to public education. But we do have homeschooling here. You can do that. So, you know, people tell me, Bob, homeschooling, only trained professionals can teach children effectively, and by that they mean people who have gone through our state's education colleges and are certified teachers. What's wrong with that assumption?
Well, I think first of all, parents are their child's first and best teacher. You know your child better than anybody else if you are an intentional, purposeful parent. And you desire more for your child than anybody else ever will. When we decided to homeschool, our children were going to the public school system, and it was working fine. We had a nice neighborhood school, but my second oldest son had some learning delays that they were trying to figure out what to do for them. And the principal actually recommended back in the 1990s, there's this new thing called homeschooling, and we think you'd be really good at it and be worth your, helpful to your son. So 23 or 24 years ago, we became homeschoolers, and we were just going to do it for a year, which a lot of people say, well, we'll do it for a year. But we liked it so much that we kept doing it, and it has been a huge blessing for all of our kids. My husband and I both happen to have college degrees, but I do not think, in fact, statistics and research show that there is no difference between parents who have a high school education versus parents who have, say, PhDs in the success of their children who are homeschooled.
Interesting.
The success comes in the relationship you establish with your child and how you help that child envision their future and then set goals to meet that.
So I imagine some people who might be considering homeschooling think, oh, how do I get organized? How do I start? And there are certain benchmarks. I mean, I'm not sure of what they are, but I mean, by 6th grade, you should be able to manipulate fractions or
Right.
something like that. How do you learn about those things? Where do you get curriculum? Is that all doable today?
It is all doable, and I'm not an authority on homeschooling in Kansas, but I do know there are great support groups and state organizations really in all 50 states. In Colorado, we have an excellent state organization that puts on workshops for new homeschoolers. Are called introductory workshops. We have a summer conference that a multi-state region comes to, and all of those things are available. In fact, now there's something called the Homeschool Summit, which is an online delivery system for a conference where you can watch different things about curriculum, how to organize your house, things like that. And I think everybody has concerns about, well, how would I start? Well, it's like everything else. How did you start your first job? How did you get married and start your marriage? You just jump in and start. You research. You find out, you ask people that that are having success, maybe how they got started. But more than anything, I think parents just need to decide, this is what I want to do for my family, because either God's telling me to do it or I want to do it, and you just start. And there will be struggles along the way. You'll wish the yellow school bus would stop at your house. I had days like that too. But having done it so long and having 6 children graduate from my family's homeschool and seeing how they succeed as adults is amazing. They have a work ethic. They have moral and character. They help other people. They work hard at their job. They are loving adult children who I choose for my best friends. And I think those are the blessings of homeschooling, that you're not trying to get your kid into Harvard, but if you're a Christian, you want your kid to spend their heavenly eternity with you. And along the way, you become your child's best friend by the time they're an adult. Parents cannot be their children's best friends when the children are young. But as the children mature into adulthood, they can be fantastic co-workers and friends.
Interesting. How can you, the homeschooling parent, judge their own success at teaching their children? Are there tests or so forth?
Yes.
I don't want to say you should submit them to the same standardized tests that the state schools use,
Right.
but I would think that if you'd want to make sure that you're at least, they're moving along, I guess.
Right. And I think there's a number of ways you can do that. First of all, where your child's at. You know there are a lot of different scope and sequences that say, a 5th grader should be starting to read novels,
Okay.
things like that. And you find those guidelines, and if your child is higher than grade level in math, lower in English. You just learn to know that, especially if you start when your children are young. And I advocate work with your preschoolers. That's when they start learning. They can count going up and down the stairs. They know how to help look at the prices at the grocery store. It's important that you know your child's strengths and weaknesses, and you help them soar in their strengths, and you help them come to a level of functionality in their weaknesses. I've had several children that really struggled with reading, but then when they started reading, I can't get a book out of their hands.
Yeah.
So not every child reads at 2nd grade. I had children reading at 5th and 6th and 7th grade. But they can do fractions when they're cooking. You know, there's just so many ways that they can learn that aren't teaching to the test, especially when it comes to history, civics, science, things like that that are so important.
Well, very good. We're going to take another moment off, and we'll be back in just a moment with our last segment of Wichita Liberty TV for this week. Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks, and with me, author Shari Howard McMinn this week. Shari, a lot of criticism of homeschooling says, well, these kids, they're just at home with only one or just a couple brothers and sisters. Where's the socialization come in? What do they do about sports and band and orchestra and things like that? How do homeschooling families work with these issues?
Well, I think that's a really good question, and a lot of people do have concern. I often say I'm not raising a socialist, so it doesn't really matter.
Okay.
But of course, we do go to church. We do 4-H. My kids take private music lessons. They are out and about in our community. I'm an outgoing person. They come with me. But even the most sheltered of homeschool children, and I know quite a few of them, are wonderful people. And, you know, right now in our society, we have overwhelmingly horrifying socialization going on in a lot of areas where teens get together, whether it's on, you know, Facebook or cell phones, or whether it's at private or public high schools, at the malls.
And you're saying socialization in a negative sense.
In a negative
right?
sense, yes. And so the best way for kids to learn positive socialization is to be with their parents. Mike Smith, who's the founder of HSLDA, which is the Homeschool Legal Defense Association, once said, and I loved what he said, my children are well socialized because they're with me. And my kids are the first to arrive at a meeting. They help clean up. They play with the younger children. They are helpful members of our society. They know how to work as a team. They know how to communicate. On our farm, once a week, we have a team meeting, so everybody talks about what livestock chores are doing. The kids hand off, you know, the chicken care for the week with the cattle care, and everybody talks and communicates, and you can do that. I think homeschool children talk more to their parents and to their siblings than in any other form of education.
And especially you living in a rural area, a lot of people in Kansas, you know, we do have large expanses of rural area, although Kansas as a whole is only a little more rural than the nation,
Right.
Believe it or not. They say things like school choice and homeschooling, they don't work in rural areas because there's so few people and things like that. That seems to be a criticism that a lot of people believe in Kansas.
Well, in Colorado, we live in a very, very rural area with a small town community, and there are a number of homeschool families in our community, but we also we do 4-H, so we're with a lot of other families whose kids go to public school, and I think that no matter where you live, whether you live in an urban high-rise or 30 miles from the nearest town like I do, homeschooling works if you want it to work, and like anything else, if you put your heart and soul into it, and you show love and kindness and example to your children, your family will thrive with it.
Do you think that every family is suited to being homeschool parents, do you think, or are there some people who should just, you know, use the public schools?
Well, I think that's a good question. I think we have a problem in our country right now where parents aren't actually parenting their children. So, you know, there will always be a segment of our population who, you know, they could not homeschool because they're not into being a parent. But I think for parents who love their children and want the best for them, it is a great educational system. And especially for children who learn outside the box, whether maybe they're going to be a concert musician or a professional football or baseball player like Tim Tebow, or maybe they're going to be an entrepreneur when they're 15 and start their own, small computer startup business. I think for anybody who's a little bit outside the box, it is absolutely the best way to go.
Yeah, and I know some homeschooling parents that are just like that. So very interesting. Well, Shari, we're out of time again for this week. So Shari McMinn, thanks very much for appearing on Wichita Liberty TV. I'm your host, Bob Weeks, and we'll see you again next week.